know, I spent a week this summer at the triennial gathering of the colleges and universities of the Anglican Communion, of which Kenyon is still a part. Fun fact. This summer in Melbourne, Australia. And the theme of the conference was around rebuilding community and discerning truth. And so it was fitting that a significant number of our conversations and our speakers addressed in Australia the realities of the Indigenous community and work towards reconciliation among Indigenous peoples and white European settlers in Australia. And one of our speakers, I remember particularly, Uncle Ray Miniacon, I believe was his name, who was speaking about his own journey of forgiveness, working through this reflection on reconciliation within his own ministry as a Christian pastor. And he has a phrase that has stuck with me, and I beg the students to indulge me because I also inflicted this upon them at our interfaith gathering a couple weeks ago, which is that forgiveness is giving up the hope of a different past. And it stuck with me in the weeks and months that have followed, because I feel like in my own struggles with forgiveness, which is one of my greatest spiritual struggles, I will be honest, and I think is probably true for many of us, when I get stuck is when I get stuck in not being able to get past the past of harms and hurts that I have experienced, getting stuck in wanting reality to be different. And what does the framing of forgiveness, of giving up the hope of past being different, and embracing instead the hope of a future being different, reframe the notion of forgiveness for us, particularly in light of today's gospel, which is a challenging one. This parable of these slaves. I know when we had our Bible study this week with the students, we sort of finished reading it and everyone just kind of went, whew, that's a rough one. And I think the reality is the church has a very difficult history ourselves when it comes to forgiveness. Forgiveness is at once, I think, one of the greatest and most problematic teachings we have at the heart of our religion. Right? We hear this story of the one slave who receives the great forgiveness of a huge debt from his Lord, and when approached by another with an even smaller debt towards him, cannot extend the same forgiveness of what was owed and is thrown fully into torture. And the same will be true for any of us who cannot forgive another from our hearts. And I think we have to be very, very real that forgiveness, as it has often been taught by the church, becomes a sort of guilt-inducing, another one of those finger wags that puts a great burden on us, especially those who have received harm, injury, abuse, communities that have been subject, such as Indigenous communities, to systemic oppression and injustice. The attitude that has often been from the church has been, well, you're supposed to forgive. We need to be able to move on. And when that message of forgiveness becomes a burden on those who have experienced harm, abuse, marginalized communities, especially when that message of forgiveness is not accompanied by the expectation of restitution on the part of those who have done the harm. Forgiveness is no longer good news. And I have to believe with my heart that something in the message of the gospel has been deeply missed and corrupted. And here is where the framing of this difficult parable in the conversation between Jesus and Peter becomes very helpful, right? So remember that for those who were with us last week, or if you were in another church that follows the lectionary, we heard a discussion, sort of this step-by-step process of reconciliation in the church, right? How to manage conflict when there is harm done within the community of faith. And it's following up on that conversation that Peter then asks, how much should I forgive? How many times should I forgive someone who has wronged me? And the number of 7 is a number that indicates fullness, perfection, right? Peter's saying 7 times sounds like he's saying a lot. And Jesus' response of 70 is actually saying the limit does not exist. And far from being just well, you have to forgive someone as many times as they ask you, and the burden is always on you to do the forgiving and to solve this transactional dilemma of harm with forgiveness in a sort of quid pro quo accounting. What Jesus is actually saying is that the attitude and the posture and the reality of forgiveness is something that defies quantity. It is not about a transgression. It is not about a quid pro quo. It is not about even individual acts in and of themselves. Forgiveness is a posture, an orientation, a choice of what reality we actually want to live in. Do we want to live in a reality that is defined by a strict accounting of harm and restitution and grievance and punishment and payment? Or do we want to live in a reality defined by the abundance of God's grace? And the choice of that reality will define how we live in relationship with others. And I think the fact is we do live in a world that is deeply punitive with regards to our attitude towards justice. And that is true on a population level, and it is true on an individual relationship in how we relate to one another. And on some level, it is very understandable. Whether we think about movements like the Me Too movement that happened a few years ago, or just the reality now where we don't want to let, for example, politicians, actors, celebrities get away with saying or doing something that is harmful because we believe in accountability. That in and of itself is not wrong. It's fair. It is justifiable to want those in power, those who have done harm, to have consequences and accountability. That is very, very, very real. And yet, at the same time, I cannot help but feel that we get caught up in that mindset, that trap of considering past harm, past transgression, past wrongs or pain, and we want those wrongs to be paid back some way fixed. We want the past, frankly, to be different. And that reality is not possible. And what we are being called to in the good news, in fact, of the gospel, the good news of forgiveness, is living in the hope not of a different past, but hope of a better and a different future. Hope that what has been so wrong can, in fact, be made right. That is the ultimate hope of our faith. And I think the promise to us, and what I hope perhaps relieves some of that burden of forgiveness, is one, the assurance, as we heard in our text last week, that a posture of forgiveness, a posture of grace, does not always lead to reconciliation in this life. Our gospel text from last week spoke of situations where, at some point, a person who is not repentant, a person who cannot reckon with the wrongs that they have done, is actually not restored to community. Forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation, especially if it means putting oneself or a community back into a position to be harmed again. We are also assured in that response of Jesus to Peter, of the posture of forgiveness essentially being infinite, beyond our computation, that ultimately the full reality of forgiveness is the work of God. And our calling as a church, as a community of faith, and as individuals is to put our hope and our trust in that promise of forgiveness that is ultimately beyond our computation and our comprehension. And to live forward in a hope of all that is wrong and unfair and unjust in our world, having in the fullness of God's scheme of hope and reconciliation being made right. In the words of my favorite Julian of Norwich, trusting that all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be made well. Believing that, living that, trusting in that, looking forward in that hope and expectation takes, at times, in the brokenness of our world, a tremendous act of faith. But it is a choice to live in a world defined by hope, not living bound by our pain, our transgressions, our burdens. And that is truly